When we looked at the tale of the two farmers, what became apparent is that it's entirely possible for a person to do all the right things and get a bad result, and do all the wrong things and get a good result. And the reason for this is that results and contribution function very differently. Results are always concerned with what you get from the world, and in essence don't sit in your own hands, whereas contribution is concerned with what you give to the world. Results are not in the power of the self, contribution is in the power of the self. And really, when you're holding people accountable, what you want to do is you want to focus their attention on that which they have power over. This relationship between contribution and results suggests that somebody's contribution can either be positive or negative, and the results that they achieve could be positive or negative, which basically means that there are four fundamental permutations that are at issue here. The first permutation is what happens when the person does what was required of them and they produce a good result. And the implication from an accountability point of view would be straightforward. They should be recognized or rewarded. The second contribution is when the person does what's required of them and they achieve a bad result. Now, our argument is that in this case one should still recognize or reward the person. And reward may be appropriate because maybe what the person did actually stopped a catastrophe and not just a poor result. However, in any event, one has to account for the disconnect between contribution and result. And there could be one of two possible reasons for this. The person's either done what's required of them but didn't produce the result because of an act of God. In other words, something that hit the organization from left field. Now, if this was what happened, then it would be perfectly appropriate to do exactly the same thing in the next reporting cycle. In other words, one wouldn't change the standard for contribution. The other possible reason why there could be a disconnect is that the person's standard was not appropriate. In other words, they did exactly what you asked them to do in the reporting cycle, but what they did would never achieve the result required. And in a case like this, it's appropriate, therefore, to change the contribution in the next reporting cycle. The third permutation is that the person doesn't do what's required of them and it doesn't produce the required result. In this instance, it's obviously appropriate to censure or punish the person. The fourth permutation is the most complex because this is what happens when the person doesn't do what's required of them and gets a good result. Now, in fact, it might be perfectly appropriate in this instance to reward the person because maybe what the person did was actually to go the extra mile. In other words, they didn't stick to the standard because the standard was inappropriate. However, it might also be that this could be an example like the Johan Farmer example, where the person was just lucky, in which case one could even censure the person. It might even be appropriate to punish the person, and this would particularly be the case where what the person did was destructive in the medium to long term, but achieved a short-term result. So, for example, if one had a manufacturing manager who short-circuited all the safety procedures in the business just in order to achieve a production target, a person like that should obviously be dismissed. Now, how this relates to the issue of accountability requires us to separate in our minds the tasks that people do and the outcome or the results that people do. And we have to bear in mind that the tasks, in a sense, are what the person gives, it's what sits in their own hands, and the results is what they get. And if you want to have an empowering relationship with somebody, what you have to focus their attention on is what sits in their power. In other words, the tasks that they do. Now, this suggests that when one takes this logic through to a set of reporting relationships, one would have the following. If one had a look, for example, at the worker in a manufacturing environment, the worker does a certain set of tasks against a standard operating procedure, and he would produce a set of results at the end of a shift, for example. Even in the case of the worker, it's entirely possible that all four permutations of accountability can happen. The person can do what's required of them and get a good result. The person can do what's required of them and get a bad result because, for example, the electricity failed in the factory. The person can do all the wrong things and get a bad result, obviously. And the person can do all the wrong things and get a good result by, for instance, short-circuiting the safety protocols on the particular machine that they run and produce the result, but actually was taking unacceptable risks in the process. In other words, even in the worker's case, it's possible that one could have all four permutations of accountability. When one now looks at the overseer's role, it's clear that the overseer does a certain set of tasks himself and also produces a cumulative result from all the people reporting to him. And those tasks that he would do himself could be things like doing a production plan for his boss or sitting in on a job grading committee. However, the bulk of what the overseer does actually gets delivered through the worker. And his contribution with regard to what the worker does actually is about giving the worker the means, the ability, and the accountability for the worker to do what's required of him. Which basically means to say the overseer's accountability, what sits in his own hands, are the tasks that he's doing and the means and the ability and the accountability that he gives to his subordinate. So when one holds the overseer accountable, one should hold him accountable for that fundamentally. Similarly, the boss produces a set of results, but his personal contribution to the results that he's producing is to do a set of tasks himself and to provide the overseer with means, ability, and accountability. Those variables are his accountability. And exactly the same logic would be true for Lord Creosote. Now, how this relates to the issue of responsibility is that, in our view, the issue of responsibility is concerned with results. It's really concerned with what one gets. And accountability is concerned with what one gives. And the rationale for this is that responsibility is a softer word. It kind of describes something which one has a custodial charge over, whereas accountability is a harder word and actually indicates consequences. In a sense, accountability is the thing that we're going to punish you for. Now, a good metaphor to understand the difference between the two variables is to think about the relationship between the Vice-Chancellor of a university and the university. It is clear that the Vice-Chancellor has a custodial responsibility with regard to the entire university. The whole university is his responsibility. However, if a student in a zoology lab stabs another student with a scalpel, then clearly the person who is accountable for the stabbing is not the Vice-Chancellor, it's the student. Which means to say that the Vice-Chancellor isn't personally accountable for everything that happens because that's not where his hands sit. His hands are concerned with the tasks that he immediately has to do. His responsibility is the whole university. His accountability is to do those tasks that are appropriate at a Vice-Chancellor level. The next thing to bear in mind with regard to the relationship between responsibility and accountability is that responsibility is about the definition of result areas and is actually cascaded top-down. So in a military example, the brigade commander gets an objective. He reassigns the total brigade objective to the battalion commanders in the brigade. The battalion commanders do the same. They reassign the battalion commanders to a smaller set of company objectives to the company commanders in the battalion. The company commanders do the same with the platoon commanders. In other words, the assignment of responsibility is cascaded top-down, and it's about the apportionment of smaller and smaller result areas to smaller and smaller groups down the line. Accountability, however, is concerned with what people have to do themselves. Now, if we go back to the manufacturing example, it is apparent that one can't work out what the supervisor has to do himself until you've worked out what the worker has to do. The means and ability and accountability that the supervisor should be contributing to the worker are based on what the worker has to do himself. So that suggests that accountability is constructed bottom up. So if we think about a line of command, the worker produces or delivers a set of results, and those results are his responsibility, is what he gets. His accountability, on the other hand, is concerned with what he should be doing himself. The overseer produces a set of results, and those results are what he gets, but his accountability is to do some tasks himself and to give the worker the means, the ability, and the accountability to do what's required of him. Similarly, the boss produces a result, and that's his responsibility, but his accountability is to do some tasks and to provide the overseer with the means, the ability, and the accountability to do what's required of him. And finally, the Lord Creosote produces the entire result for the entire business. That's his responsibility, but his personal accountability is to do some tasks and to provide his subordinate with the means, the ability, and the accountability to do what's required of him.